Chapter 67 of the Tao Te Ching begins with a blunt admission. The world views this Tao as great, yet it appears inferior to every other system of teaching. It looks small, weak, and intentionally submissive. Conventional strategies for power rely on visible kinetic markers, prioritizing the accumulation of mass, rigid hierarchies, and forward momentum. The Taoist framework removes these markers, operating by absorbing and redirecting force rather than meeting it with equal resistance. This alternative logic is detailed across three interconnected passages, chapters 67, 68, and 69. These texts are frequently categorized as mystical or passive poetry. Examined as a sequence, however, they reveal a unified treatise on the mechanics of asymmetric power. This system treats yielding as an active mechanism for systemic dominance. It is a method of optimizing the energy available to a smaller force. We will decode this architecture by moving from its foundational axioms to its application in individual combat, and finally to its macro battlefield results. Understanding how a posture of weakness wins a war requires us to first identify the generator that powers the entire system. Chapter 67 establishes three foundational axioms, called the Three Treasures. These act as the required inputs for the Taoist strategic model. The first treasure is Si, or gentleness. The second is Zhan, or economy. The third is a refusal to take precedence over others, a state of structural humility. This bipartite graph shows the causal link Laozi establishes. These three restrictive traits function as a generator for specific, aggressive tactical outputs: boldness, liberality, and leadership. The link between gentleness and boldness is a matter of psychological focus. By centering one's intent on the protection of others rather than the survival of the ego, the practitioner removes the fear of personal consequence that usually inhibits bold action. Economy operates as a literal reservoir. By strictly limiting the expenditure of energy and materials, the actor builds a surplus, allowing for a sudden, liberal application of force when the situation demands it. Finally, by avoiding the front of the line, an actor avoids being targeted first. This allows them to outlast rivals and emerge as the only viable candidate for leadership once the primary contenders have exhausted themselves. Attempting to deploy the outputs without the generators leads to systemic collapse. Boldness without gentleness is merely reckless aggression. Expansion without economy is overextension. Laozi concludes that without these foundational constraints, the end is simply death. In this framework, strength is a derivative property. It cannot be manufactured directly. It is the inevitable byproduct of disciplined restraint. Chapter 68 applies these axioms to the individual level, defining the figure of the sage warrior. This warrior intentionally lacks martial port. They operate with outrage, using a calm, detached focus that an opponent cannot easily read or manipulate. Laozi calls this matching heaven. This is the alignment of individual action with the indifferent laws of physics rather than the volatile impulses of human emotion. This diagram illustrates non-contention. The sage is targeted by direct kinetic forces meant to provoke a reaction. The sage executes a physical refusal to meet force with force. Yielding the point of impact causes the opponent's energy to overshoot and dissipate into empty space.
This requires total emotional detachment. Any surge of ego creates a rigid point of resistance, providing the enemy with a surface to strike and destroy. The sage further optimizes this by placing themselves below others. This lower, receptive posture turns the adversary's own forward momentum into a liability. The sage acts as a conduit, allowing the attacker's force to carry them right over the sage's shoulder. By neutralizing ego and anger, the sage becomes an empty vessel. They dominate by refusing to participate in the exchange of blows, forcing the adversary to fight against their own momentum. Chapter 69 scales these individual mechanics to the battlefield, detailing the movements of entire armies. This map shows the tactical relationship between the host and the guest. The red host is the force that initiates the war. The blue guest is the force that responds. The host expends energy by holding territory and advancing. The guest maintains a fluid posture, conserving every possible resource for as long as the engagement lasts. The strategy is retiring a foot rather than advancing an inch. As the host engages, the guest yields proportionally, avoiding decisive contact. This continuous retreat forces the host to stretch their lines, thinning their own structure against empty space, while the guest remains compact. Lao Tzu warns that lightly engaging in war is the greatest possible calamity. A reckless head-on engagement breaks the foundational generator of gentleness. It forces the warrior back into a kinetic, ego-driven mode of combat that rapidly depletes their power. This leads to the central tactical paradox. When weapons are finally crossed, the victor is the one who mourns the conflict. This mourning serves as evidence that the warrior is still operating from a position of restraint and gentleness. By deploring the need for force, they ensure they remain in the defensive, energy-conserving posture of the guest, which ultimately secures the win. This diagram reveals a complete, tiered architecture of strategy. Each level is structurally dependent on the one below it. The causal line is direct. The restraint of the three treasures enables individual non-contention, allowing the superior geometry of defensive retreat. This philosophy relies on the principles of energy conservation and structural redirection. It treats conflict as a problem of physics. Understanding this requires removing the ethical and moral associations normally attached to words like gentleness and humility. These traits function as mechanical prerequisites. They allow an actor to survive kinetic conflicts that would normally destroy a more rigid, aggressive force. This reality explains the text's final claim: heaven will save its possessor by his very gentleness protecting him. In this context, Lao Tzu's concept of heaven does not mean a moral deity. It refers strictly to the indifferent, inevitable flow of natural processes. This protection is the predictable outcome of aligning one's strategy with the structural reality of the environment. A force that yields and redirects energy is inherently more difficult to destroy than one that relies on direct, expendable strikes. Ultimately, true strategic power is consistently found in the capacity to absorb kinetic impact and simply outlast the opposition. The force that appears inferior is simply the one that has mastered the physics of the long game.